loving me fort. Au cœur, que ce n'a pas une folie.
There was a time when the world believed it knew exactly who Hedy Lamarr was. A face that defined beauty, a presence that lit up every screen she appeared on. To millions, she was perfection, graceful, distant, unforgettable. But what if that image was only half the story? What if the very thing that made her famous also kept her from ever being truly understood? In a culture that often celebrates appearances first, her life quietly asks a deeper question: how many people are seen, but never truly known? Stay with me, because what lies beneath her story may feel closer to home than you expect. In the golden age of Hollywood, when movie theaters were filled with velvet seats and glowing marquees, Hedy Lamarr stood at the center of it all. Studios didn't just promote her, they presented her as an ideal. The camera loved her, and audiences did too. Her face appeared larger than life on screens across America, from New York to California, becoming a symbol of elegance and allure that few could rival. At a time when stars were carefully shaped and managed, Hedy seemed to fit perfectly into the mold. She played roles that highlighted her beauty, mysterious women, romantic figures, the kind of characters audiences admired from a distance. And for a while, that seemed like success. Fame came quickly. Recognition followed. She had everything the industry promised: visibility, admiration, and a place among Hollywood's elite. But there was something quietly limiting about that success. The roles didn't change much. The expectations didn't either. While other actors were given chances to stretch, to transform, to reveal new layers, Hedy remained consistent. Predictable. Not because she lacked depth, but because no one was really looking for it. And over time, something subtle began to happen. The more she was celebrated for her appearance, the less space there was for anything else. The spotlight, bright as it was, only shone in one direction. For many watching back then, and even now, it raises a quiet question: when the world decides what you represent, how do you show them who you really are? There's more to her story than what the cameras captured. Let's take a closer look. Behind the carefully lit scenes and polished performances, there was another side of Hedy Lamarr that rarely made it into the public eye. When the cameras stopped rolling and the studio lights dimmed, her world looked very different. Instead of scripts and rehearsals, she spent her time surrounded by sketches, ideas, and mechanical parts, quietly exploring a passion that had nothing to do with Hollywood. From a young age, she had been curious about how things worked. Not in a casual way, but with a kind of focus that led her to take apart objects, study systems, and imagine improvements. By the time she was living in the United States, that curiosity had grown into something much more serious. During World War II, like many Americans, she wanted to contribute. But instead of war bonds or public appearances, she turned to invention. Working alongside composer George Antheil, she helped develop a system known as frequency-hopping spread spectrum. The idea was complex, especially for its time, using rapidly changing radio signals to prevent interference and keep communication secure. In simple terms, it was designed to guide torpedoes without being easily jammed. It wasn't something you'd expect from a Hollywood actress in the 1940s. In fact, most people never even heard about it. The patent was filed. The concept worked. But the response was silence. The Navy didn't adopt the system during the war. The technology was considered too complicated, too unconventional. And perhaps, though no one said it outright, it didn't fit the image people had of her. An actress, especially one known for her beauty, was not someone the system was ready to take seriously in the world of military engineering. So the invention sat, largely unused, for years. Meanwhile, her public life continued on its familiar track. Interviews focused on her looks. Studios promoted her image. And the deeper part of who she was, the part that built, questioned, and created, remained almost entirely invisible. It's a striking contrast, isn't it? A woman celebrated in one world, quietly dismissed in another. And it leads to a question that still resonates today: how often do we overlook someone's true capabilities because they don't match the role we've assigned them? there's a tension building here, a gap between who she was and who the world allowed her to be. And that gap would only grow wider with time. Let's step into that turning point together. That growing gap didn't just stay in the background, it began to shape the course of her life. In Hollywood, identity wasn't something you owned. It was something assigned. Studios built personas the way factories built products, carefully, efficiently, and with very little room for deviation. For Hedy Lamarr, that persona had already been decided. She was the beautiful one, the mysterious one, the woman audiences admired but never quite expected to understand. And once that label took hold, it became nearly impossible to escape. She continued to take roles, but they rarely challenged her. Scripts arrived, similar in tone, similar in depth. While other actors were occasionally allowed to reinvent themselves, to age into new kinds of characters, Hedy remained frozen in time, expected to represent the same image, year after year. It didn't matter that she was growing, thinking, evolving. The industry had no real use for that version of her. Meanwhile, her work outside of Hollywood, her invention, her ideas, remained disconnected from her public identity. There was no bridge between the two worlds. In one, she was admired. In the other, she was overlooked. And the distance between those realities began to take a toll. Imagine living a life where one half of who you are is constantly visible, while the other half is almost entirely ignored. Over time, that kind of imbalance can wear a person down. There were attempts to break free, of course. Moments where she pushed against expectations, where she sought roles that might reflect more of her inner world. But the system was resistant. Hollywood, especially in those decades, didn't easily rewrite the narratives it had already created. And so, a quiet frustration began to build. Not loud, not dramatic, but persistent. Because it wasn't just about career opportunities. It was about recognition. About being seen as a whole person, not just a surface. About having your abilities acknowledged, not dismissed because they didn't fit the image others preferred. As the years went on, that tension became harder to ignore. The fame that once seemed like a gift began to feel more like a constraint. The very spotlight that brought her success also limited how far she could grow within it. And here's where her story starts to feel less like Hollywood history and more like something deeply human. Because how many people, in their own way, have experienced something similar? Being known for one thing, one role, one version of themselves, while carrying so much more beneath the surface. Hedy Lamarr's life, at this point, wasn't just about movies or inventions. It had become a quiet struggle between expectation and identity. Between what the world wanted her to be and who she actually was. And when those two forces pull in opposite directions for too long, something has to give. Let's continue, because what came next reveals the true weight of that struggle. And in time, something did give, but not all at once. It wasn't a dramatic fall, not the kind Hollywood often writes into its own stories. There was no single moment where everything collapsed. Instead, it happened gradually, almost quietly. Roles became less frequent. The calls slowed down. The industry, always moving forward, began to look elsewhere. For someone who had once been one of the most recognizable faces in America, that kind of fading can feel disorienting. Not because the work disappears overnight, but because the attention does. At the same time, the invention she had poured her energy into remained largely unrecognized. The patent for frequency hopping eventually expired. Years passed. Technology moved forward, but her name was rarely mentioned alongside it. The idea lived on, without her. That, in many ways, was the deeper loss. Because it wasn't just about missed credit. It was about something more personal, the sense that a meaningful part of her life's work had simply been overlooked. Not rejected outright, not debated or challenged, just set aside. Meanwhile, her personal life carried its own weight. Relationships came and went. Several marriages ended. And with each passing year, she became more private, more distant from the public world that once defined her. By the later decades of her life, she was no longer a regular presence in Hollywood circles. She rarely appeared in interviews. Photographs became scarce. The woman who had once been seen everywhere was now, in many ways, unseen. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with that shift. Not the loneliness of never being known, but the loneliness of once being known everywhere and then slowly disappearing from view. And perhaps even more difficult than that is the feeling of not being understood in the first place. Of knowing that the version of you the world remembers is only a fraction of who you truly were. For Hedy Lamarr, the story wasn't just about fading fame. It was about carrying a life that had been, in many ways, misread. Her beauty had been documented, celebrated, preserved in film. But her mind, her ideas, her contributions remained largely in the background, waiting for a recognition that didn't come when it mattered most. And that's where her story becomes especially poignant. Because failure can be confronted. It can be named, examined, even overcome. But being quietly overlooked, that's something else entirely. It leaves no clear moment to fight against. No single point to reclaim. Just a long stretch of time where something important was missed. And yet, even in that quiet stretch, her story wasn't finished. Let's keep going, because what happened later would change how the world finally saw her. And then, years later, long after the spotlight had moved on, something unexpected began to happen. The world started to catch up. By the 1990s, as wireless communication became a part of everyday life in America, from early cell phones to the first waves of Wi-Fi, the underlying technology traced back to principles Hedy Lamarr had helped pioneer decades earlier. Engineers and historians began to revisit her patent, recognizing just how ahead of its time it truly was. This time, her name wasn't overlooked. In 1997, she was honored with the Electronic Frontier Foundation Pioneer Award, a recognition that placed her, finally, among innovators rather than just entertainers. It was a quiet moment, without the flashing cameras of her Hollywood years, but in many ways, it carried more meaning. Yet there was something bittersweet about it all. Because by then, she was in her 80s, living a largely private life. The recognition came, but not during the years when it could have changed her path, her opportunities, or how she was seen by the world around her. It raises a gentle, lingering question: what does recognition mean when it arrives after the moment has passed? Still, there's something powerful in the fact that the truth surfaced at all. That eventually, the world looked again and saw more. And maybe that's where her story leaves us, not with a perfect ending, but with a reminder worth holding on to. If this part of her journey resonates with you, stay with me. There's one final reflection that brings it all together. When you step back and look at Hedy Lamarr's life as a whole, it becomes something more than a Hollywood story. It feels like a quiet reflection of a truth many people carry, especially as the years go by. Because life doesn't always recognize us at the right time. Sometimes we are valued for the wrong reasons. Sometimes the parts of us that matter most, the ones we build in silence, with care and intention, go unseen for far longer than we expect. And sometimes recognition comes only after the moment when it could have made a difference. But that doesn't mean those parts didn't matter. If anything, her story reminds us that who we are is not defined by what others choose to notice. A life can be misunderstood, even overlooked, and still hold real meaning, real contribution, and quiet impact that reaches further than we ever see. Maybe the lesson isn't about waiting to be recognized. Maybe it's about continuing to be fully ourselves, even when the world only sees a fraction of it. And perhaps, just as important, it's about how we choose to see others. Because somewhere, in our own lives, there may be someone whose story we haven't fully understood yet. If this reflection stayed with you, take a moment and carry it forward in your own way.